All right, so we've been doing a lot of big fish fishing this kind of preseason, and as I'm getting ready for my Elite Series season, I'm opening up new rods and rigging all my combos for the year. But the last couple videos we did were, centered around swim bait fishing and big fish fishing, and I just wanted to walk you guys through my swim bait setup. Is it only one setup? No, but what I'm going to talk about kind of covers, what you look for in a swim bait setup, and when you go to select a rod for some of these bigger lures. The last thing we want is for you to be heartbroken when you finally get that 8, 9, 10 pound bite. So you have to be prepared for that big bite. Earlier in my career, I mentioned it before, I'd just pick up a 7.5 foot flipping stick, a 200 size reel, 20 pound monofilament, and I caught a lot of big fish doing that, 12s and 13s up in Northern California, but I also got my heart broken. I lost a lot of big fish with that setup. So yes, you can use a 7'9", 7'10", 7'11" flipping stick type rod, but really when you're going after and you're targeting those larger than normal fish with the larger than normal baits, you have to be loaded for bear. So I want to walk you through my swim bait setup. There's a couple little examples here, but basically what I look for is an 8-foot rod. Love an 8-foot rod. It's the perfect blend of just power when you're launching that swim bait. It's comfortable to fish. Some of the 8.4s, 8.5 footers, I've tried those. 9 footers, tried those. It's just too cumbersome. So the 8-foot length is just perfect, and I basically use two. This is the 13 Fishing swim bait rod, 8-foot heavy swim bait, and the 8-foot extra heavy swim bait. And what I'm going to talk about here, I don't advise a guy to go out and buy two. They're affordable, $180. That's very affordable. I don't advise the guy, the beginner, to go out and buy a whole line of swim bait rods. Really just pick one 8-foot heavy type swim bait rod. And this one's perfect, and this is why. Swim bait rod, you want a longer than normal butt section. This one's kind of cool because it's kind of flattened right here, so that when you pair it with a 300 size reel or a 400 size reel, which is required with this big line and big lures, that kind of flat really helps you palm that big setup really, really well. So longer than normal butt. It's got to have a foregrip in my opinion. It's stouter than normal. It's stouter than a flipping stick. It's kind of pull cuey, if you will. And then another big feature, characteristic of a swim bait rod, in my opinion, is it's got to have double-footed guides all the way up. This is a heavy-duty blank, that bends a lot when you're throwing these giant 4, 5, 6 ounce lures. So it's got a lot of bend to it. The double-footed guides just helps guide your line all the way through that blank, all the way throughout the duration of that cast. So the two setups here, heavy and extra heavy. Keep in mind that you could swap out your line and kind of adjust the action of the rod just by switching out your line. For example, if I have an extra heavy swim bait rod and I've got it on a 25 pound test fluorocarbon, that's going to be the ultimate power. Minimal stretch with the fluorocarbon and a lot of horsepower with that extra heavy action. Now, if I were to swap this 25 fluoro with, let's say, a 25 pound test old school monofilament's very, very stretchy, so it kind of brings that extra heavy action down a little bit to, as maybe you're throwing a treble hook style topwater or a glide bait. You could kind of adjust the action of that extra heavy rod with the type of line you choose. Does that make sense? And conversely, with the heavy swim bait rod, which is a little bit lighter than the extra heavy, the heavy's got a little more give to it. You pair that with a monofilament, that's just perfect for those top water treble hook swim baits, the big lunker punkers, the MS slammers, things like that. And then you pair the heavy with a 25 or 30 pound fluorocarbon, and that stiffens up this rod a little bit because there's minimal stretch with the fluorocarbon. So you can kind of play with it. And trust me when I say this, on a really long cast with a swim bait, a 25 pound monofilament, it's got so much stretch, and it seems like it stretches maybe 2 yards on a real long cast. so you could adjust it that way. So one of my favorite setups is the extra heavy swim bait rod with a 25 real stretchy monofilament. I can move a lot of fish that way. There's a lot of give on the hook set, a lot of stretch. And then, you know, going over to the heavy, you pair that with a non-stretchy fluorocarbon, and the actions are really kind of similar. So over the last couple weeks here, we've been spending a lot of time with the glide baits. I really like that extra heavy with the glide baits. When you start getting into the really big swim baits, and when I say big swim bait, I would say about a Huddle. Everyone, all the West Coast guys know Huddleston or bigger, you know, your big glides, you know, the 250s, some of the other custom, you know, 9, 10, 11 inch swim baits. The extra heavy will handle all of those swim baits beautifully. So let's call it a, you know, a 6 ounce plus lure. You know, we all spend our hard-earned money on these giant swim baits. Even I'm, you know, myself, Johnny holding the camera, you know, he buys those $200, $300, $400 swim baits. I'm guilty of it. I know a lot of you guys are too. You have to have the wood to throw those giant swim baits. So the heavy is great for those typically smaller swim baits, 6, 7, up to 8 inches. But again, if you're throwing those heavier 5, 6 ounce and up swim baits, absolutely have to throw the extra heavy swim bait rod. So let's just say the extra heavy is the only rod I have in the boat at the time. You know, it's nothing for me to take off this 25 pound test fluorocarbon and re-spool it with 25 pound test monofilament. Gives me that stretch, and then I could dive back down into the smaller swim baits on that extra heavy rod. Let's talk about the reel and the gear ratio. That's a big deal. This is a 13. This is an A3, Concept A3, and it's a 300 size reel. The spool is a little bit wider than your normal bass size reel. It's deeper than a normal bass size reel. Accommodates that 25 and 30 pound test really well. You know, oversized knobs, gotta have that. But the most important detail here in the reel, I love a 6:3 to 1 gear ratio reel. I do not like an 8 to 1. I do not like a 7 to 1. 5 to 1 is going to be a little too slow. I believe 6:3 to 1 is the perfect gear ratio for these large swim baits. Here's why. I'm always talking about low and slow. We want to work these swim baits low and slow along the bottom, or the glide bait, you know, quarter reel at a time, just moves it nice and slow. We want to make this thing appear natural as possible. With a 6:3 to 1 gear ratio reel, when a fish bites it and you set the hook, you just want to start winding. And a 6:3 to 1 gear ratio reel, I believe, is the perfect blend of speed and torque. You know, you ever been flipping with an 8 to 1 or even a 9 to 1 gear ratio reel, you know, close quarters, you set the hook, you're up here, and you try to get that reel moving, an 8 to 1 reel or 7 to 1 reel moving, it's just too fast and you can't get the torque on it needed to move that big fish. So a 6:3 to 1 reel is absolutely perfect in moving that big fish. There's just more torque there and you don't feel handcuffed with that ultra high gear ratio. So 6:3 to 1 is an absolute must. It's got to have the power handles on it. So that's pretty much my overall setup in a nutshell. You know, just 2 rods, 2 different actions, but the same length. You know, I love making those long casts with that longer than normal butt on this rod, and I always have my rod down there at about the 9:30 or 10 o'clock position. I always want to be in position to set the hook. You know, my feet are always planted. Again, when we're throwing the larger than normal stuff, when that fish bites, I want to be in position, that rod at 10 o'clock, and I want to take a step back with my back foot and give it all it's got. Give everything this extra heavy, or give everything this heavy rod has got into that fish. These lures have, you know, all of them have, you know, larger than normal hardware. So you got to give them the wood every time that big fish bites. Those 8, 9, 10 pounders have very hard mouths. So that's why we're using these larger than normal rods. It really makes a difference. And a lot of times it's a difference between, you know, catching that lunker fish, that share lunker 13 pounder, or the big fish of the tournament, just by the swing of that hook set right there. And that's why it's so important to use kind of that 8-foot rod. So you guys can comment below on any questions. I'll do my best to address those questions. But it's got to be an 8-footer. It's got to have double-footed guides. It's got to have a longer than normal butt if you want to throw these larger than normal swim baits. Again, we're targeting huge bass. The last thing you want is to get that huge bite and miss it because your rod's too soft, or break the line, you know, because you're throwing 17 or whatever it is. You don't get a lot of bites anyway. You might as well make them count with the right setup. Hopefully these tips, these things I talked about today, will help you select another a good rod, a good addition to your arsenal, and help you guys land some of those giant bass that we all love catching.